Hello and welcome back to another session of Back Porch Forestry. I'm Dr. David Merker, Extension Forester with the University of Tennessee, and I'm happy to be with you today. Last week at this time, we had about 10 inches of snow on the ground, and the birds were, well, I guess you could say they were panicking a bit, but today it's just a splendid day, and I guess you could say that the birds are giddy today. My favorite new bird is the eastern towhee, a delightful little fella that frequents the forest edge. Its song says, drink your tea, drink your tea. And so that's what I encourage you to do today. It's a little bit chilly, so pull up a bench and maybe get some hot tea. And with that said, we'll join our session of Back Porch Forestry. Share the screen. Back Porch Forestry are informal sessions. Typically, I like to say they're 30-30s, roughly 30 slides in about 30 minutes. And today's session, we're going to be talking about hickory trees, specifically identifying hickory trees that are native to Tennessee. Hickories truly are an American group of trees. Of the world's 23 known hickory trees, only 3 are found outside the United States. Hickory wood is widely acclaimed for its strength and durability. You might recall that General Andrew Jackson was nicknamed Old Hickory during the Battle of New Orleans because he was as tough as hickory. Hickory wood is prized for tool handles due to its strength and ability to absorb shock. The wood is also used for fence posts and furniture, interior furnishings, firewood, heating, and cooking as well. The use of hickory for cooking and smoking meats is still common. The wood is heavy, it's dense, very hard, tan or maybe a light brown, makes beautiful cabinets, and with considerable character. Hickory drumsticks and handles for hammers and axes and other striking tools remains unmatched for minimizing muscle fatigue. Hickory nuts were once an important and common human food source. The kernel inside the nuts were crushed and added to baked goods, broth, cornmeal, and mush. Hickory can be tapped just like maple trees to make syrup, although the sap contains less sugar. Hickories grow moderately slowly, often resulting in very narrow annual growth rings and dense wood. Some species, such as pignut and sand hickories, as you'll discover today, are found on drier hilltops, while others, such as water and shellbark hickories, are more often found in moist drainages and near swamps. Collectively, hickory species account for about 8% of all the live trees in the state of Tennessee. So this session of Back Porch Forestry introduces you to what I'm calling brief recognizable features, the briefs. Briefs are unique features that are easy to remember and will help you in differentiating the 10 species of hickory that are native to Tennessee. I would like to begin by giving photo credits to, you'll see a number of professionals across the bottom of this slide, and their photographs were incorporated into this presentation. So I thank them very much. Let's go ahead and get started. To get started identifying hickory trees, to begin with, of course, we must first determine whether or not your unknown tree is in fact a hickory tree. It's helpful to examine a number of features. Obviously, we think of the leaf, but of course, leaves aren't present roughly half of the year. So it's good to scuff around on the ground and try to find some fruit. Of course, study the bark and the twigs as well. So we're looking at leaf, fruit, bark, and twigs. And we begin with the leaf basics. Now, the first photo on the left obviously isn't a hickory tree. That's a northern red oak, but I've thrown it up here because I want to quickly differentiate between a simple and a compound leaf. We have prior covered this in a back porch session on dendrology, if you want to refer back to that. But you'll see on the left photograph, there is clearly the leaf, but then the stalk of the leaf at the base is called the petiole. And what I want to point out is that there's one leaf and one picture, and one petiole in this picture. We contrast that to the photo on the right. That also is only one leaf. It looks like to some people it might be 7 leaves, but it's one. It's a compound leaf. And compound leaves have several smaller leaflets that collectively form a larger leaf. And so you'll see the petiole, that's still the base of the stalk of the leaf. That portion of the petiole above where the leaflets begin is called the rachis. And then we have 7 leaflets that go around the rachis. And so hickories have compound leaves. It's perhaps the difficult part of identifying hickory trees is that the number of leaflets varies anywhere from typically 5 to 7 leaflets and sometimes even more. And so that's why we want to look at other features other than just the leaf basics. Regarding the fruit, we have to differentiate between the fruit and the husk and the nut. The nut is the innermost. The husk generally splits along distinct suture lines when it's mature to expose the smaller interior nut. Now, the casing of the nut is called the shell, and it's generally quite hard with a nutritious kernel inside. So if you followed that, we've got actually 5 parts to this. We've got the fruit itself. The husk is the outer portion that surrounds the nut. And then the casing of the nut is called a shell. And inside this shell then would be the kernel, which is where the energy is and what wildlife and even humans like to eat. Thinking of bark basics, the bark of hickories is very hard and it's durable. It's not at all cork-like as we see with many species. Often it separates into either short or long scales. You see the photograph on the left, you see those scales are very long, but other times the bark can be flatter and with distinct ridges. But in all cases, it's pretty much going to be hard when compared to something like, for instance, elm or other species. Now we think of twig basics then. Before we get into identifying the actual species, I want to finish up with twig basics. Most hickories have a very stout twig. You'll see on the left there that twig is stout, and it has what we call a true terminal bud. So you see the twig and you see the bud. Now, hickories typically have an oblong shaped crown with what we call preformed growth. So you see 2 photos here. You see the hickory and then you see the black willow. I threw the willow in there just so I could contrast this stout twig. So for instance, willow, you see what we mean by when we think of a flexible twig. But also because you do see a distinct terminal bud on the hickory, and you won't find that on other species. I said that hickory are preformed, and what this means is that it forms a terminal bud, and there's a resting period between the time that it forms the bud and the time that it flushes again. Now, that's not always true with other species. Other species have a continuous type flushing, unlike this. And so we call that sustained growth. And essentially, this means that trees, the branches, the limbs, the twigs can continue to flush new foliage throughout the growing season. They'll actually overproduce leaves, but then oftentimes many of those leaves will abort when it gets real dry and hot in the middle of the summer. So hickory is different than some other species. So let's go ahead and begin now with identifying these 10 hickory trees that are native to Tennessee. And I begin with bitternut hickory. Bitternut hickory is found throughout Tennessee and is found on a variety of sites, including rich soils, loamy or gravelly soils, even found sometimes in lower wetlands and along stream borders. As its name implies, the nut of this species is bitter nut. Now, as I go through these 10 different species, I'm going to cover each species in what I think of as a kind of a descending order of the more prominent brief recognizable features, the more prominent briefs, and that's just according to me. And so I will begin in the upper left hand discussing the photos and progress clockwise. So the most distinct brief recognizable feature for bitternut hickory is its mustard yellow, almost naked looking terminal bud. So in the upper left hand, you'll see that yellow looking bud. The bark progressing around here is somewhat unique too, in that it is broken into patches that kind of differentiate or vary between gray to cream in color. Also, it's only one of 4 hickories with fruit husks that have ridges along the suture. So you can see those ridges that stick out on the husk itself. And then typically bitternut hickory is going to have 9 leaflets in the lower left, 9 different leaflets. Now, we advance here to examine mockernut hickory. Mockernut hickory is found throughout Tennessee, generally on moderately fertile uplands, but also on dry ridges and side slopes. Although it's somewhat difficult to crack, the kernel inside this fruit itself is sweet. Now, a distinct brief for mockernut is the almost chocolate colored bark. That's how I identify this species fairly easily. The bark resembles that of black walnut, which is also chocolate, but black walnut's even darker than mockernut. Also, as you look at the upper right, the underside of the leaf has a dense mat of hairs. Not only the leaf, but on the rachis itself, you can see those hairs. The fruit has a husk that's thicker than red or pignut hickories, as we'll see, but it's thinner than shagbark, which is really thick, the husk is. And finally, it's one of 4 hickories having 9 leaflets. Now, if you remember, the prior species, bitternut, also had 9 leaflets. So I want you to look at this leaf very closely, and you see the 9 leaflets, and then look back at the bitternut hickory. You can see the leaves are very, very similar to one another, and that's why we have to look at these other characteristics like bark and the fruit and the buds as well. So that's mockernut hickory. Pecan hickory. A lot of people don't realize that pecan actually is a hickory. Pecan is primarily located in the western part of the state of Tennessee, where it occurs both naturally and in planted orchards. It is normally found on deep, moist, but well-drained soils along creeks and perhaps drainages. The nut kernel, the meat or the kernel of the pecan is sweet, of course, we know that, and it's a favorite for pies and other baked goods, maybe it's a topping or dessert, or even as a snack. The 2 briefs that stand out with pecan, at least to me, of course, the fruit is undeniable. It's oblong in shape, which is unique to the other hickories. And then as you look at the leaves, and more specifically the leaflets to the right, you'll notice that the mid-vein of these leaflets is actually curved. Can you see that curve to that mid-vein? And it's offset, it's off-center. And that is something that's very unique to pecan, that mid-vein that's curved and then it's off-centered. Finally, the terminal bud has a silvery gray look to it. So in the lower left, you'll see the lateral buds are brown, but that terminal bud, particularly on the very end of it, can be silvery gray in appearance. And that separates it from the other hickories. So there's 3 brief recognizable features that will help you with pecan. Pignut hickory. This can be found throughout Tennessee, generally on the dry ridges and hillsides with well-drained soils. The nut of the pignut, although sometimes edible, is often rather bitter. And that's actually how it got its name, because the settlers, as they moved in, the sweeter hickory nuts of many of the other species, they saved for themselves, but then they fed these bitter pignuts to the pigs. Now, thinking of the briefs, a brief that's unique to pignut is its easily recognizable kind of a pig snout shaped fruit. Can you see the snout of the pig on that fruit? That's unique. That separates it from the rest of the hickories, and making it, from that standpoint, very easy to identify. But as you look at the upper right, along with 2 other hickories, it usually has 5 leaflets. So the shagbark hickory has and southern shagbark, as you'll see, has a leaf that's similar, and that's why we like to look at the fruit. Now, the bark has small scales and is difficult to differentiate between the red hickory, which I'll show you next. But what really stands out, if you can find the fruit, is that snout on the fruit that makes us realize we've got pignut hickory. We're going to contrast pignut hickory then with red hickory. Red hickory is common throughout Tennessee, usually on dry, well-drained upland ridges and slopes, and it's often found in conjunction with the prior species, pignut hickory. It is sometimes referred to as sweet pignut because its nut is sweet, while that of pignut is typically, of course, bitter. Now, red hickory and pignut hickory are very difficult to differentiate with just looking at the barks and the leaves. The most prominent brief for the red hickory is the base of the petiole. I want you to see right here. This is the petiole itself of the leaf, and then the base of the petiole has a reddish hue to it. You can see it here, there, and there, and that's distinct. Now the fruit is more rounded than that of pignut. It does lack that snout, that pig snout, and the fruit also tends to split open along the sutures. The bark has small, tight scales. Again, I want you to look at the bark of red hickory and compare it. I'm going to back it up just one to the pignut. So take a good look at that bark and then look at the pignut bark. Can you see how similar that is and why they're very difficult to identify just looking at the bark, particularly in the wintertime? Leaves are commonly, of the red hickory, are commonly without hairs and with 7 leaflets, whereas pignut, as I mentioned, has 5 leaflets. Sand hickory. That's one that many people probably never knew existed in the state because rarely do we talk about sand hickory. It's located sporadically in Tennessee, most commonly on the Cumberland Plateau region, and particularly on very dry uplands. The nut of this species, again, is typically sweet. Now, thinking of the briefs, the buds, the petiole, and the rachis of sand hickory are covered with irregular kind of clumpy hairs. So you can see them as you look at the rachis and the petiole and even the leaves. There's clumps of hair that stand out with sand hickory. Further, the fruit is coated with minute yellow scales. So if you look closely at the fruit, this yellow scales kind of stands out and gives the entire fruit kind of a yellowish hue. The husk of sand hickory is thin, and tends not to split open readily along the sutures. And examining the leaves, they have 7 leaflets, although sometimes 9, and they tend to be kind of narrower than some of the other hickories that we talked about, thinner, if you will. Shagbark hickory is common throughout Tennessee. It's the one that most people think about when we talk about hickory. They'll say, well, it's got shaggy bark. And it's true that shagbark does have shaggy bark, and it's tolerant of both dry and moderately moist soils, growing along creeks and mountain coves, hilltops, and slopes. The nut has a sweet kernel and is sometimes produced and actually sold commercially. But I mentioned it has shaggy bark, talking about the briefs, but there's actually 4 species of hickory in Tennessee that have this shaggy bark. So other than this shaggy bark, the other primary brief recognizable feature is this very large fruit with a very thick husk, up to 1/2 inch thick. So in the right-hand corner, you'll see the size of that fruit, and look how thick the husk is. Further, the terminal bud on the end of the branch is larger than most hickories and with dark outer scales that kind of end in a point. So you can see these darker scales right there kind of surrounding the bud itself, and they end in a point. Oftentimes they'll stick out distinctly. Sometimes they'll be flat up against the bud itself. But that really stands out with shagbark hickory. And then again, there are 5 leaflets in the lower left, but that looks very similar to pignut hickory. That's why oftentimes as I teach it to youth, I say 5 shaggy pigs. In other words, if it has 5 leaflets, it's most likely going to be shagbark or pignut hickory, 5 shaggy pigs. But shellbark hickory also has this shagginess, shaggy look to it. Shellbark hickory has a sporadic presence in Tennessee, with greatest concentrations in the Mississippi and Tennessee river bottoms and the western highland rim in Middle Tennessee. It's primarily a bottomland species, often found in deep, moist, but well-drained soils. It has a very large nut, this species, and it's also with a sweet kernel. Now, considering the briefs, again, I've mentioned that it has the largest of all fruits of all the hickories. Take a look at that. That's actually my hand holding that thing. So it's, roughly half the size of your palm. But it also has a terminal bud that's very elongated, up to 1 inch. So take a look at that terminal bud. It's distinctly almost an inch in length. The leaflets number 7, whereas with the shagbark they number 5. And the bark of shellbark hickory is very shaggy, even more so than shagbark hickory. Continuing with species with a shaggy bark, we have a southern shagbark hickory. So there's the shagbark and a southern shagbark. It is a distinct species. It's scattered throughout Tennessee, but most common in the central and kind of south central regions. It grows on upland ridges, side slopes, particularly on limestone dry soils. And like the larger fruit of the shagbark and shellbark, the kernel of southern shagbark is sweet. So this species is very difficult to differentiate with shagbark hickory. The leaves are similar, but they're smaller, they're less hairy, and the fruit is also smaller with thinner husks. Finally, the southern shagbark hickory twig is much thinner than that of shagbark, and you'll also notice that it does have some black scales on it, as does shagbark, but they don't end in a sharp point, as does the shagbark hickory. So the final hickory tree with shaggy bark then is the water hickory. Water hickory has a very limited presence and range in Tennessee. I've only seen it a few times. It's kind of restricted to the Mississippi River Basin in the far western region of the state. Although it is more commonly found on poorly drained soils, heavy clay soils where it can outcompete other heartwood, it actually does prefer better drained bottomland soils. The small flat nut of this species typically has a bitter kernel. In studying the briefs, perhaps it's the fruit that is the most unique feature of the water hickory, and it's somewhat flattened. So take a look at this picture of the fruit itself. These ridges are very distinct on the sutures, but then oftentimes the nut will be flat on one side. The bark often has a slightly pinkish or maybe reddish hue. Doesn't scale maybe quite as much as the other shagbarks do. The leaves have narrow leaflets resembling, when I look at the leaves, it makes me think of pecan because they're very narrow. It has that mid vein that curves and is maybe slightly off-centered. And then the terminal bud also looks a lot like pecan, although it's not a silvery gray. It actually has that yellow look to it, as does the bitternut hickory. So that concludes our presentation. There is a survey that I encourage you to take part in if something you'd like to express. This publication is actually summarized, or this presentation is summarized in a very detailed publication that goes into greater detail, titled Identifying Hickory and Walnut Trees. We go into walnut as well, native to Tennessee. This was co-written by Karen Coors from the University of the South, and then from the University of Tennessee, David Buckley and Brian Otsby. So you can find the URL back on the YouTube site, or just type this up. You can even just Google the title and my name, and you'll find it as well. So thanks a lot. It was great seeing you on the back porch, and look forward to our next session. Bye.